So this is our next start of our next unit, which is pollution, and so this is talking about water pollution. So the opening case is looking at Chesapeake Bay, and basically, where are the main pollutants in the Chesapeake Bay coming from? There's three main sources, so know those three main sources. And how is it affecting the bay? So what is it doing to the bay? And then how do increased sediments affect the organisms, including algae? So is it causing algal blooms? How do those nutrients go into the water? How do they affect the organisms, especially the plant life, and the bass as well, that are in the Chesapeake Bay? And then the last part of that opening case, how did the Chesapeake Bay Action Plan benefit the blue crab? So I know that's pretty specific, but there is a plan that they had to kind of mitigate these pollution areas. And so one of the big benefiters were the blue crab, and so know kind of what it did to their population. So moving on to the actual module 41, it talks about wastewater from humans and livestock. So what things are considered to be wastewater? So what exactly is wastewater? And what is the difference between a point and a non-point source of pollution? So what is meant by where does it come from exactly? And then it talks a little bit about biological oxygen demand. So what is BOD? And how does that change with water pollution levels? So you need to know what it is. And then how do you increase or decrease in pollution? How does that affect the oxygen demand? Okay, then moving over to page 504. When we look at nutrients, we learned back at the beginning that about the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. So what do those two cycles, what happens to those things, nitrogen and phosphorus, when they're introduced into the water? So naturally, or it could be through pollution. So how does nitrogen and phosphorus affect water? It could be positive, it could be negative, it could be both. And then over here, how is cultural eutrophication different from just regular eutrophication? So how are those two things different? And then what events lead to cultural eutrophication? So what is that, and what can lead to that? And then moving down below, why do dead zones exist? So what are they? What causes them? Where are they at? How have they increased throughout the last 20 years or so? And then moving over, how does human wastewater affect rivers and lakes? And then what diseases are caused by wastewater exposure? So know the specific diseases that are caused by wastewater. And then moving on to page 506, WHO, which is the World Health Organization up here. They estimate that 2.1 billion people don't have access to clean water. That's a quarter of the population. That's pretty significant. And then I put this little note up here, looking at that number. In your last book, which was just 4 years ago, this number was 1.1 billion. So it's almost doubled in 4 years, which is really disturbing, I thought, that, 1 billion more people. And I know that the Earth's population is growing quite a bit. But that's quite a bit of people without clean water. And then, the previous page looking at the diseases that are caused by that, it's pretty devastating, I think. And then moving down, what do high levels of fecal coliform bacteria indicate? So if we see that in the water, if we measure that, what does that indicate? And then where does E. coli come from? So E. coli, I'm sure you've heard of it, and it's often on strawberries and things that are imported from Mexico. But it is found in humans, so it is normal to have it in your body, but not in your stomach. So it's normally found in your intestines. But where does it come from? And then it's a form of coliform bacteria. So E. coli is a form of coliform bacteria. And then moving over here to septic systems. So how do we get rid of this sewage that we create? So why doesn't every house have a septic system? So here is a septic system shown. So why don't we all have those? Why do we have centralized sewage treatment plants rather than everybody having their own? So think about places we live, rural versus urban versus suburban. So that's the main factor there. And then if we look at this plant up here, this is a sewage plant, a typical sewage plant. So know the steps. Just know kind of in general what's occurring at each step, what's happening, and what's the purpose of bacteria. So you can see in step 4, we add bacteria, and basically it needs to break down the raw material into something that's more susceptible to, or able to be placed into the river or lake, and it's not toxic to everything. And then down below here, how does a septic tank work residentially? So that picture was kind of on the left here, and it talks about it up here with the sticky note. So how does that work versus a large municipality, which is the large municipality would be like a city. So how does this differ from the home one? So what are we doing differently in this versus the home treatment plants? For the home septic tank, I mean. Okay, and then moving to 508, what problem do tertiary systems help to alleviate? So this is talking about sewage plants. So there's a third step that we can add, and some sewage treatment plants do. So what does that do? Like, what is the purpose of that, and how might that help the rivers and streams and lakes that the treated water is going into? And then the next section talks about legal sewage dumping, which is kind of disturbing in a way. But how does this occur? So how and why do we allow legal sewage dumping? It has a lot to do with rainfall. And think about like what's happening now with our weather, excess rainfall in the winter here. And then to do the math, building a manure lagoon. Down below here it says, what is a manure lagoon? So I'm sure that you can probably take some guesses. But read about it, figure out what exactly that is, and how are they kept safe. So what do we do? It's not just putting manure into a lagoon, but how do we keep it from just filtering down into the groundwater? And then this calculation has to do with calculating the size of the manure lagoon. So say you are a cattle farmer and you've got a certain number of cows or property. How big do you need to make your lagoon so that it's so that you can sufficiently get rid of the manure and not have a toxic problem? So just know how to calculate that. And we'll spend a day doing some math calculations like we did in the last unit. Okay, and that is it for 41.